A very common pattern in Vue is to have a button like this, and pretty much any framework on the front end, to be honest. You might have a button and then you'll have a modal, and then maybe you'll have a form inside that modal. So let's just say this button is to create a tag, and then you might have, for example, a tag form, and that might be a separate component. And then when you click on this button, you've probably done this a million times before, unless you're new, of course, which is totally cool. Modal is equal to true. And then for the modal, we might be modeling modal. And then down here, you can imagine that we'd have a bit of data that says modal that's set to false by default. So this is kind of a high level view of what it would look like. Obviously, you need to actually build the modal component or use a library. But this is a very common pattern that you'll see people doing in Vue a lot. And so I used to do this a lot, but then I found that my components got very cumbersome very quickly. And so you might have multiple modals within this component, especially when you're displaying tables and buttons inside tables. This gets very old very quickly and difficult to maintain. And so I thought, okay, maybe I can do this better. And so upon further exploration and research, I ended up with a pattern that kind of looked like this. So let's just say this is for creating a tag. You create a modal which is a create tag modal, and we're not actually building the components in this video. We're just going through the more sort of high level concepts. So you might then have the create tag modal, and inside that you would put the button and you would put the modal itself. So this is really classic Vue stuff that you've probably seen before. And then within the create tag modal, you'd have the modal data property, and then all of this is contained. So in your component, all you have to do is something like this: create tag button, and then you can just throw that anywhere in your application. So that's pretty cool. However, I ended up hitting a problem, and this is what we're going to talk about in this video. And it's not a big problem, but the solution is pretty cool and has some turns out it has some pretty cool side effects as well. So the next problem that I started facing is that this wasn't necessarily a button. Maybe instead of clicking a button, you would be clicking a list item. So for example, when you have a drop-down menu, you might have a list item in that drop-down menu that's clickable. And so I thought, oh, crap, well, we're going to have to create a new component for that. So pretty much copy paste things and change this from button to list item. And already things are starting to feel a little bit icky. And I'm starting to be like, oh, why am I repeating all of this code just to change that to a list item? And then later on, you might have to do this for a link. And so you're copying the whole thing again, and you're making this maybe just a link. And you can see that this breaks down very quickly, and you're like, well, why do I have to create 3 different components for something that's pretty much the same thing? And that's where I came up with this idea of the clickable component. And I'm sure that it already exists, but I'm just naming it the clickable component because that's kind of what makes sense to me. And so the way we can solve this problem is we can have a component that might say, for example, on click, open, create, tag, modal. Something like that, okay? And that might seem a little bit verbose to you to begin with, but I promise you, every single word in this is pretty much needed. On click, because we need to know what the action is. Open, create, tag, modal. I'm sorry, this is the event, and then the action that will occur. So I decided, right, it'd be really cool if I could just do that and then throw whatever I want in here. So maybe this could be a button, all right? Maybe it's not a button. Maybe it's an li item inside a drop-down menu. Or maybe it's just a simple link, or maybe like a span or a div, or absolutely anything at all. So I thought, okay, that's a cool idea. Let's see if we can create this component. And now, before we actually do this in the real world and create an actual working component, I'm just going to give you sort of the pseudocode of what that might look like. So within the onClick component, we're going to need a div, and this is going to be the clickable div. So when we click that, we're going to say modal is equal to true, or I'm usually a little bit more descriptive here. So something like show modal is equal to true when whatever's inside this div is clicked. All right, and then underneath that, we're going to have the modal itself. Okay. And then inside here, we're going to slot whatever's inside the onClick create tag modal. So we're just going to say slot like that. Okay. So let's just quickly walk through what's happening here. So let's just imagine that we're using this component. So I'm going to grab that and paste that in there. And let's just say we're going to have a button, the sort of simplest example. Imagine we've got a button in here. So what's going to happen is this button, all right, because we're using this component, it's going to be injected here, right, where the slot is. And therefore, this button, when it is clicked, will open the modal, all right? And so because of that, we can make this a button, we can make this a span, we can make it a div, and we can basically move this functionality anywhere in our application. So this is mostly for bigger applications. So if you're in a scenario where you're probably just going to use this on a button, sure, it probably doesn't make sense to go this far and make a clickable component like this. However, I found that especially in my job when they're asking me to change things around every now and then, it's really cool to be able to just wrap it in this. So they might be like, okay, we want to put this in a drop-down menu now, or we want to add this to the side menu, or we want this functionality in like a whole bunch of different places. It really helps to be able to have this extra little level of abstraction. All right, so that's why I came up with the idea of the clickable component. Chances are it already exists, but in these videos, we're going to call it the clickable component. And in the next video, we're going to actually build it using a framework that I love called Quasar. All right, so watch the next video if you want to get an idea of how this works in the real world. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful.